Okay, so I probably definitely ran out of energy at the end of the last recording, and uh, things sort of, I think, fell apart quite a bit, although I have generally covered that thesis before in other recordings, specifically going into personality disorders and basically cluster B type presentations within the context of the Kegan stages. And now I think I've finally come to the realization that I will have to sort of create my own model, which is in some sense, I guess it's kind of like a superimposition of something very similar to the Kegan stages onto the four sides of the mind model in the, well, in some section of the Myers Briggs, generally spoken about by C.S. Joseph. I would say he's, or at least he's the public face of four sides of the mind. Um, so yeah, and then I have a particular ontological model, um, and essentially a model of development, which still has high structural correspondences to probably things that Kegan stages of development point at, but the thesis that I didn't fully bear out in the last recording, which I kind of never got back around to completing, was essentially that Kegan modeled his apex of maturity and integrity essentially around the wrong cultural stereotype. And basically, he modeled it after people who were STEM, scientifically minded, or successful in, in some sense, I will say, Keegan didn't so much even, I think, understand or properly model Keegan stage 4, or the fourth level of development, or because essentially the only thing that existed within society was something like people who had a stable enough time for flexing what I would call the kind of the transpersonal bridge between Keegan stage 3 and Keegan stage 4, which is something like a kind of zero sum status, um, sort of three ring circus. I'm not describing this very well. Let me take another crack at it. So, and this is a feature that I it crops up all over the place. But essentially, when uh, a particular community or subculture or organization or membership class um, doesn't have properly contended positive purposes. They don't have positive values and positive purposes. So in because they can't, as individuals within their membership, actually contend a stable positive purpose, um, they have to do the next best thing. They have to basically say, well, our purpose is as positive as it can be, and it's somewhat a reflective or reflexive resilience against some narrative force or some narrative influence. So it's sort of they are just high status within the narrative. So they've got what is some kind of canonical narrative. They believe that they are a part of some deeply um, and this is quite interesting as well, because in some sense what Keegan stage 5 is, what in terms of what it's modeled as by Keegan, or I take this from secondhand sources, but essentially what I see it understood through these secondhand sources, at least, that when it's explained to me, is that basically it's a it's a Keegan stage 3 in a kind of equilibrium, in that it has transcended its own systematicity, which again was just a kind of canonical narrative, but it does so by essentially reframing that canonical narrative as being able to contain epistemological pluralism. So it's a kind of it's a fluid nihilism, and it does this effectively by aggregating to itself um, a high status which is somewhat fabricated out of the projection of negative integrity or negative purpose elsewhere. So you're projecting negative purposes on the out group so that you can reflexively sort of indulge in a kind of private autoplasticity. And so, and autoplasticity is a phrase that I basically sort of bastardized, at least as it was introduced to me in the form that Sam Buckton spoke about, autoplastic defenses. And my particular, let's say, reframing of borderline personality disorder, for instance, was that you shouldn't care about alloplastic defenses or autoplastic defenses. It all fits under the rubric of autoplasticity. And when you see it like that, then you can start to see that there are ideological variants, which I would say identity politics has fully lent itself. In some sense, identity politics is indistinguishable from overt fascist ideology and overt fascist mythological narratives of being the sacred victim and social injustice. I mean, they had all the same narrative markers as the current social justice warriors or so-called progressives, um, just different labels that mean the same ideological substances. But and by the way, I do historically link this in that Hitler essentially sympathized with his one mother figure, at least one mother figure in his life, clearly had borderline personality disorder, probably his mother, because I mean he was raised by his aunt or something like that, and so you can just imagine that and he obviously, I mean I don't actually know the particular history, but I wouldn't be surprised to hear that his original mother was in some kind of mental health asylum, perhaps, and he visited her, or it was, and he deeply sympathized with the psychiatric injustice, or something like that, or he found a way to humanize that kind of borderline personality disordered secondary psychopathy, um, because he could see the rationality, he could empathize with the rationality, which was anyway, how I would describe borderlines as being secondary psychopaths, and in some sense, I think that it's a matter of metaphor to call them a secondary psychopath. But and by the way, there are many male secondary psychopaths as well. Obviously, it's much more prevalent in the female population, but essentially. Emotions are used as a medium essentially to ascribe and impose and project beliefs. And in some sense, the reason why it is correct to call borderline psychopaths is because they, in some sense, their emotions are completely indistinguishable from their conscious, rational correlation between those emotions and their beliefs. They're not saying, I'm upset because you did something. They're saying, you did something that caused my upset. It is foremost the belief correlate which they are um, tracking and monitoring, and then they solipsistically guard the access to that chessboard that they are privately and demonically in some sense. I mean, sorry, that's a bit of a metaphor, but essentially, that I think is the best way to understand what a secondary psychopath, a borderline personality disordered person is doing. Is they are privately a demon playing chess while outwardly expressing emotional um, affectation, but essentially their emotional affectation is a kind of solipsistic soapbox exhibitionism in order to cultivate and to captivate an audience and to control that audience by unilateral uh, emotional performances. Um, and usually this won't just be alloplastic uh, manipulation, it'll also be it'll also sometimes, when it completely doesn't see a way to alleviate or to take back control or to, usually they go through cycles of trying to discombobulate and sort of through a kind of decompartmentalization of their selected host or their selected audience, which they're trying to essentially inculcate a kind of a stable codependency with, or some such system of relations. Um, Usually, when that breaks down, then they'll go through a phase of psychosis and autoplastic sort of re-emergence. They will overtly re-engineer a new social mask, um, and sort of push a reset button and try and get back into the same uh, um, strategy. Because in some sense, the strategy is is more primal than the actual clothing, than the valence itself. The valence is just the means to the ends. Um, and the valence, and they can even have multiple valences. They're very good chameleons, as it were. And in some sense, this is why it can strike people as odd to find out that someone in a working environment, which is, let's say, very culturally steeped in let's say high integrity functionality, because they're an underling, then you realize that, well, as soon as that borderline personality disordered person gains enough unaccountable authority, then things go off the wagon, or perhaps if there is a certain level of sort of soft cultural um, framing that maybe they will stay in the valence of that scenario, and then when you see those same people in their home life, it's very um, I mean, this is also why, for example, some mothers can be entirely different mothers to this to the same female woman will be a completely different mother to different children. Uh, you know, and it so the compartmentalization, the valences. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to drive at um, is that in an identity politics, uh, because of being able to unilaterally designate one's own identity and to self identify, and then to be able to expect compliance and essentially be able to extract sympathy at mere um, sort of signaling, or at mere, that other people must change their speech patterns, that pronouns belong to the subjective projector of their to be. I mean, in some sense, the idea that pronouns are connected to gender and not to biological sex or phenotype, I think, is itself quite a strange thing. But also that the idea that conventions are there to be projected at is sadly a disgusting way in which secondary psychopaths have found a stable cultural foothold into um, essentially playing this uh, uh, game of unilateral, um, let's say, reality tunnel inception or narrative inception, that at their choosing, at their own designation, and they can, um, uh, import, uh, this weird. I mean, you can see this also with all borderline presentation generally, is that there'll be some kind of rational dilemma, some kind of cerebral, um, uh, nebulousness, and that nebulousness will then be capped or, solidified, or kept in a state of indecision, to then be able to, have a kind of emotional exchange, or a kind of emotional, conditioning or imprinting, um, or at least a report of being, emotionally afflicted. And that emotional narrative will then have to be followed in order to find some kind of resolution to the nebulousness or the indecision. So in some sense the and then in some sense the the rational atmosphere gets incepted within the emotional resolution of the borderline. And this is essentially how borderlines, get their hooks into their hosts, essentially. um, and this is, I mean, this is how, secondary psychopaths, and of which there are much many more. I mean, I can't. I will have to, suck my thumb to. But I mean, I would argue that, I mean, you see, it depends, because there are. Yeah, I mean, it depends how you count them, because in some sense the stereotype and the model of secondary psychopathy has now become so culturally normalized, um, that, also because of identity politics, I would say as well, but essentially the ideological, hybridized cerebral, um, secondary economy, which is largely fueled by, narcissistic, um, I would say, sort of white knighting, of what I would generally, and this is a bit of a metaphor, but I would generally call them cerebral histrionics, um, is, sort of, becomes become the pets, of these sorts of, uh, culturally empowered, let's say, embodied sort of queen bees of the ideological, hive. Um, and in some sense, I think this is exactly, what Hitler envisioned, when he was constructing his sort of psychological technology and, ideological structure, which was always, in some sense, promoted by feminine energy. I mean, that was why people became Nazis, were because the woman got them into it. The woman made the Nazi Party, what it was, quite literally. in some sense, it was a kind of proto empowerment scheme. Um, anyway, these threads can be hard to follow, I guess, because the identity politics dogma has rigid things that would obviate the kind of traditionalism which was within the motif of the Nazi Reich and regime and ideology. Um, I guess I'll just have to say you have to take my word for it that essentially these mythological models, it doesn't, they're all about denying the individual and about essentially uh, uh, reifying the collective spirit of some kind of lowest common denominator. And it doesn't matter what the mythology is, it doesn't matter what the standard that is being pegged, um, so long as there is a matrix of moral consideration that is vested in the collective, and that only through association with the collective identity is one ascribed any kind of moral uh, um, self-esteem or even worth. That essentially your pride is in the categorization of your identity. It's not in any kind of individualism. The individualism is only kind of salvaged through the arbitration and mediation between sociological reductionism, and that sociological reductionism will have its own intricate narrative. And the Nazis certainly had their narrative, and the identity politics people certainly cultivate all of theirs. But essentially, the Nazis essentially had a kind of, in some sense, this is the only difference between identity politics and full blown sort of Nazism, is that the idea is that at some point you can't just have a decentralized Führer. You have to have you have to elect a single one, and then as soon as you realize that political power has to actually make decisions, then you have to have a you have to actually say which identity. You know, essentially the idea is that the state can't serve more than one master. Therefore, there should only be one identity per ethno-state or per sub-state, or whatever you want to say. And so you end up with a disgustingly, sort of uh, uh, segregated. Um, yeah, but I mean, again, this is just a mirror of the ethical compartmentalization, um, which is packed into what I would call these natural fascists, which are essentially secondary psychopaths. Now, I don't want to be, I don't want to vilify these women, which are primarily women but also men, too much. Um, it is recoverable. Borderline personality disorder is treatable, but it's, I mean, it would require a general understanding, I think, of psychology to the level to which has never been achieved within society. In earlier epochs, for purposes of public health, these women were removed. These women were actually locked up in. I always forget the word, but it's where we get hysteria. I can't remember. They were called hysteriums, or I can't remember the phrase. Um, and I mean, in some sense, I sympathize. I do sympathize, and you know why these women were removed from society. They were not removed from society because of the damage that they would do to society. They were well, I mean, they were in a sense, but not in terms of that. Well, these women would go out and wreak havoc on strangers and other people. I mean, they can do that, but is that the damage that they would do to their own children, essentially? And now, because essentially of the ethical pluralism that we suffer from now, it's sort of, that's just another lived experience. That's just another, why shouldn't people be able to do whatever they want to their children kind of thing, as long as it's psychological, as long as it's psychological trauma in some sense, as long as it's hyper rationality, that's fine, or something like that. So we have, and I mean, I understand how tricky this is. I mean, I have even made arguments that essentially we need to bootstrap society at some point and bootstrap our morals, and we almost need to say that parents do have the right to abuse their children within some limits, within some certain limits. And it is certainly difficult, very difficult to say, well, that level of abuse doesn't meet the threshold, and secondary psychopathy does, even though it doesn't leave a physical mark. So, that on the face of it is a very tricky sort of standard to, and in some sense that I think is almost the crux of why society itself is in the state that it's in, is that we don't have discernment. We don't have this nuanced sophistication within our culture. I mean, there are many reasons why this is the case. I do think that there were earlier times in which people were more sane. Uh, anyway, I don't want to get into a sort of a historical treatise of sort of cultural shocks that people have not recovered from, um, that allow for this kind of unbridled sexual, because in some sense, it's amazing how so many of these things play out in the collective sort of conscious sort of uh, pantheon of um, readily uh, accessible stereotypes and such. People have a kind of Dunbar pantheon, uh, that they see themselves as being in the midst of some range of possibility of various forms of and various prevalences of enculturation and models of enculturation, and models of social expectations and sort of and the range of values that an individual, and in some sense, this is also crafted from people's lived experiences and particular observations of either statistical or generalizations, which are impossible not to retain. It's impossible not to record um, information about generalizations. I would say the point is to be conscious of them, so that you can look out for when you are applying them and how you are applying them, so that you can put yourself on notice. That is not to deconstruct them, but to essentially witness them and consciously obviate their use when possible, or when desirable, or when it's morally neutral, or morally uh, um, progressive to do so. You know, perhaps there's probably a better word than the word progressive. Now that word has been so horribly, probably is the wrong word to use as well in that sense. When it's good to do so, when it would be good to do so. Which can also be a multivariant, sort of complex question. Um, that can be very sort of context specific. And this is how the hyper rational secondary psychopaths get you. Um, they're in fact particularly good at engineering and laying down um, the requisite groundwork needed to kind of ensnare and concoct a very particular kind of scenario uh, that leads to a kind of unavoidable dilemma, because their expectations are always so outwardly projected and focused, uh, and they never take responsibility upon themselves to actually reframe their uh, sort of self-righteousness about what they are entitled to deserve. Um, and in some sense, they often try to find a linguistic hook that they have essentially extracted contracts, which then they, and so, if they can find a way to extract contradictory contracts from someone, then they've got them essentially in some kind of at least potential bind, which they will be very clever at alluding to only at the right time, at which that can be used as leverage to lead to some other kind of extraction. So usually you get a kind of cerebral rational dilemma, which is juxtaposed or leveraged or hedged towards extracting an emotional um, sympathy, uh, uh, parasitism, or vampirism, or something like that. Um, because you're not allowed to resolve the cerebral indecision, because then you're dishonoring the emotion, and then if you deal in the emotion, then you have to answer for causing the nebulousness and not already having avoided it, or not already having been better or ethically correct enough. And so you get this kind of latent hijacking of ethical language and moral language that is woven into a unilateral stream of emotions. Um, and this is basically the formulae of fascistic politics. I mean, this is how they have always gotten away with it, essentially, that the conspiracy theory, the Jewish conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theory of white privilege, um, these are equivalent. Uh, they quite frankly are the same type of slander and obtuse reductionist view of society that validates the canonical narrative and the definitional premised projection of racism. And where the answer is that actually you are the racist, and why don't we look at this in a non-racialist way and see what we come up with, and see what solutions might be had, and they don't want to do that, because it doesn't validate their feelings. Now, the crazy thing is that when this stuff gets normalized, or when this bullshit gets normalized, it proliferates, which is generally why, I mean, I've come up with the heuristic that if any particular structure doesn't have a way to essentially negate or gatekeep itself away from being um, captured by secondary psychopathy, it will invariably, in some sense, already be corrupted by it, because that's what cluster B personalities do. They look for the chinks in the armor, and they install themselves. Um, and there is a lot in culture, effectively, which is essentially, I think it might be. I mean, this. I went into this whole thing about borderline personality disorder, but quite frankly, science itself has this problem inside of it. I mean, the and you can see this. I mean, evolution. Everyone thinks that the theory of evolution is brilliant or something like that. Whereas I think eminently the most intelligent people in the field, um, or it's not in the field of evolution, I guess, but the most eminent polymaths that I know of, the only person who I would quite frankly mop the floor with Christopher Hitchens. I think even by Christopher Hitchens, I don't actually. I shouldn't say that because that's a lie. I know that by his own admission, um, David Berlinski mopped the floor with Christopher Hitchens because science itself uh, is something that is useful um, and valuable, but it's been concocted into a fucking religion. Uh, and into a metaphysical worldview, which it cannot support any of those sorts of claims. Uh, and quite frankly, when it's used that way, it's abjectly retarded. Quite frankly, it's beyond silly. Um, and when people like David Belinsky make the arguments that debunk this kind of trash and this kind of pseudo intellectual nonsense, I mean, what kind of acclaim does he get? What kind of spotlight does he get? How is he treated in French intellectual society? It just shows you how much uh, integrity there really is. Um, but I mean, I must say, I am not that. Uh, well, let me not be too vitriolic about nationalities and make such generalizations. There are people who suffer uh, in every society by the, let's say, intellectual pigheadedness that has installed itself. Obviously, some structures are more prone to un, undetectable uh, takeovers. But anyway, and this is also why I'm always. I try to be careful. I'm probably not as careful as I should be because I'm usually trying to make my own point and thesis. But Britain really should be commended for the kind of ingenious system that is embedded within its kind of culture, which in some sense I still think it can be improved upon, and in some sense, I think my country is the improvement um, from the British system. It's just sad that my system um, has fallen under the sea of the damned, in that it has overtly betrayed its own values and undermined its own integrity in such an overtly institutionally corrupt way, but it has managed to do so because of the excuses proffered to it by essentially this very evil ideology of identity politics, which has corrupted the legal structure in my country, a legal system and tradition which, quite frankly, is the best in the world. Something which even Roger Scruton essentially gave a wink and a nod to, which I'll be quite thankful for the collateral support there um, that was given. But anyway, I shouldn't just say that. Oh, well, this is so embarrassing. But there's a wonderful Australian intellectual um, who made a marvelous lecture about the Roman law. Um, I'm sure she's a professor. Oh, wait, this is so embarrassing. I think her name is Helen. Anyway, I guess I'm trying to just name the most prominent people on, but yeah, there's a plethora of intellectual thought that has essentially is locked under the tide of quite the limited spotlight, which is corruptly shone by the propagandistic sort of valence of the legacy media system. What else should I say? I'm going off in strange directions, trying to name drop. And then, the and this is all on the topic of scientism, essentially, on the scientific worldview. And science is not a worldview. It can never be a worldview. It's a methodology, and it's really quite limited in what it can reach. And the conflation of its utilitarian sort of value, but also the misunderstanding of the source of its utility, the true source of its utility, is not in the method itself, it's in the agents, the epistemic agents that use that method, that use it to channel their ingenuity and creativity, because the hypothesis does not make itself scientifically. No, it is literally as if one says, well, without the knife, without the sharp cutting, and I mean this quite literally, without a sharp cutting implement, then we don't have civilization. Therefore, we're all knifists. Therefore, we're all sharp angleists. I mean, do you see how absurdly, irrationally, imaginatively reductionist that is? I mean, really, you see how abstractly disembodied and, quite frankly, the abrogation of reason and understanding in order to employ such a disgusting and stupid model. I mean, this is what happens when you think that rationality, which is mere self-consistency, to be rational is to be self-consistent. Self-consistency, as if this only can ever be conceived of as being correctness in any sense if the self is seen as a static. So you really have to be dead to think that rationality, and I mean that metaphorically, but intellectually. Obviously, I don't mean obviously. Please, but you have to be intellectually dead in order to conceive that rationality is some kind of truth test. And this is how objective external locuses of control, objective narrative, whatever uh, projections, or I mean, in some sense, I mean, at least if you have to take ownership that these things, well, where did they come from? They don't come from the outside. At least if they supposedly come from the outside, they come from somebody else's agency and language, which is the medium of what? Of how internal products become exchanged or negotiated or uh, transferred. So, I mean, anyway, this is my model of sort of anti-realism, that everything, much the same as the Aristotelian agent causation, the rock is moved by a staff, the staff is moved by a hand, and the hand is moved by the man. It always starts with an agent. And so, you see things moving. Well, is that a condition? Or is that the effect of somebody else's agency at some point? And I would even posit that it doesn't have to even ontologically necessarily be true to say, well, as long as it's under the influence of an agent at some or other time, then it falls under the auspices of potentially being directed by agency. And therefore, if we just simply expand agency instead of just the solitary, isolated, solipsistic I to the potentiality of we, what would we do about it? What might we do about it? What may we do about it? What could we have done about it? And if I take responsibility for what we could have done about it, then I open the real task of being convincing, being persuasive, but also being judgmental enough to know uh, perhaps when the proximate obstacle is not my persuasiveness or convincingness, it's somebody else's uh, uh, internalized abrogation of some ability, of some capacity, of some facility, that they are stuck in some kind of intransigence or some kind of imag- uh, imaginary sort of dubiousness, which is perhaps an insoluble argument to be had, which is the kind of argument that you can have with hard skeptics. Um, People who have said, well, this dilemma can't be solved, therefore it's all for naught. And so I can be as divisive or diversionary um, because purpose is gated to me by my own election of this particular stumbling block or obstacle, which is my benchmark for which they have. I mean, I'm speaking on behalf of this hypothetical hard skeptic, which they have elected as their you know, I mean, there are other species of this in other ways. You know, the agnostic who still is unsurprised at their failure to reach any kind of destination uh, when they have not turned over their own structures or schemas to perhaps bootstrap some personal responsibility or some personal blame, um, which is at some point, I think, only capable in a kind of stoical mind frame. Because if one is not patient and stoic enough, I think you cannot still the waters for long enough to sort of, to use a scientific metaphor, measure the refraction. You know, when you place an object piercing the surface of the water, and then you see the I don't actually know what the term is. I've forgotten what the term is. Uh, but essentially, the displaced orientation uh, of the visual sensory I mean, I could say input or I could say perception. Or just philosophically thinking about the where the properties and where the attributes in such an example sort of land up. But you know, I mean, you got this all over. I mean, the people that knew that what Newton was doing was essentially a kind of cultural, sociological inception in some kind of rational narrative. In some sense, I do actually think that Newton did it on purpose. I do actually think he did it to delude people in order to set up this quagmire. In fact, but that's perhaps my private conjecture and conspiracy. but if he really was a deist, then perhaps he did do it consciously then. But I will say that Tesla and the ether, I think, were eminently more intelligent, at least philosophically speaking. Anyway, let me not harp on historical examples. But wow, I've really gotten off the beaten track. Let me talk about psychology. I'm sure I can do a better job at. Okay, so the link to this essentially is that psychologists have always particularly been the laughing stock of the scientific community, and in their and it is a weak field with less brain power behind it than the other fields in some sense, and probably much less prestige. But I mean, there have been some luminary figures in it, but sadly, there's not much you can do in a field that is so poorly developed, and that is the nature of the work. It is the hardest field, I would say, and in some sense, it's why the state of the academy is in the state that it's in, is because the heart of the sciences is psychology. The queen of the sciences is psychology. But instead, you have these people who are trying to lick the boots of the hard scientists and trying to suck up to the neuroscientists, who, quite frankly, are one of the most misled group of pseudo-intellectuals that you can imagine. These are people who obviously they have to find physiological correlates and things like that, but they are theorizing in ways in which are just completely unsupported by real philosophical rigor. And if you actually look at any serious polymath, Penrose, obviously the most famous in this sector, and the kind of slander and the kind of derision that he gets from, quite frankly, very stupid people who want to say that, oh, consciousness is computational or something like that. And the kind of, these people who think, oh yeah, we're going to have AIs that think like human consciousness thinks, when they have, people that are serious in the AI field know just how far they are from getting anything close to anything. I'm talking about like real intelligence, not just Turing tests. Uh, I'm pretty sure we've already got. Well, I don't know if you can even we've got things that can pass the Turing test, but I don't think that they're even called artificial intelligences. They're just sort of very advanced algorithms. I don't think that they can actually in some sense, any variation in their input to output is sort of based on some kind of I've got recordings that I've made specifically on computer learning and sort of critique, at least attempting to critique the lack of understanding in what these systems are even doing, which I've taken quite a lot of time talking to people in the field. It's usually much easier for me to bring these things up when I'm in some kind of dialogue. But anyway, I'm getting all over the place again. But I think my takedown of those things is pretty good. Let me think if I can remember it. This is a tangent. But essentially, the idea is that you've got it's a little bit complicated. You've got you've got a process that you've chosen not to name in human reason. So it becomes opaque to human understanding. But obviously, it's got some kind of how could I put it? Damn, I can't think of the word. Can I say it's got some kind of notational derivation in that you can it's going to have terms that are it's going to at least be reducible to a procedure. Um, no, I've lost the point here. Let me just think of what the overarching critique is. Is that essentially like, I mean, in practical terms, the confusion comes because you can't track the iterative steps um, that the machine learning goes through in order to derive its end sort of procedural. Um, it's kind of like a mystery box that is giving you a method. It doesn't give you an answer, it gives you a method to find answers. And because it's derived from a mystery box, somehow the method takes on a mysterious and esoteric um, status, which is supposedly uh, beyond human understanding. Essentially, because its source is veiled. But its source can be known, uh, I argue at least, in some abstract framework, or in some, you could get an intuitive modeling of, yeah, and even if you say, okay, well, that intuitive model essentially involves randomized uh, again, I've forgotten the main point. So I can't even remember the contention that I had about this. Exactly what was being argued. Something to do about the status of truth, or the status of, no, that sounds right. How would it, something about the, something like the status of reason, in that, can't remember the claim. It was something like a subclaim of a term, and the term itself was essentially an analogy or a metaphor. And essentially what that metaphor did was that it allowed you essentially to use and understand machine learning, while at the same time robbing human beings of essentially the understanding of that semantic code, that word. So that word essentially became beyond human understanding. It belonged to machine learning, and human beings essentially just had to kind of have that semantic label so that we could donate it, or essentially allow it to be corrupted by this idolatry, essentially. Um, yeah, so I've completely lost the thread here because I can't even remember the point that that I should be arguing, so I'm having problems recounting. Uh, anyway, this is quite embarrassing. Perhaps I'll just move on. But still, what I just went through was an interesting example of this same. It happens in lots of technical fields where you have this. I mean, in some sense, it happens with labeling as well, because the defining things as this is what something means, this is what something is, definitions, things that are true, um, are not true in themselves, they're true by definition. And who creates the definition, who marks the name, and on what do they mark it on? What is the record of the election? These are all operations that occur within consciousness, not externally. I mean, this is so trite, it's almost not worth mentioning, but people have forgotten it in their self-deluded narrative. In some sense, they don't see the value of faith or intuition, which I take to be the same thing by a different word. Um, Although you don't say you're faithing something, you say that you're intuiting something. But it is more grammatically correct to speak of it in some sense, the kind of, I need to learn proper grammatical words. sort of as a complete because faith in some sense is something like always in the past participle, because in terms of the contents are already worked out. It's a noun. And in some sense I think that is more grammatically cogent and accurate. In some sense, you could say intuiting is an inspirational waiting room for the faith to be uncovered or recollected in some of perhaps the I want to say Platonic. I believe Aristotle was also, or I forget if it was only Aristotle or if it started with Plato with the recollection. No, it must have been obviously Plato, of course, with the recollection of knowledge. Anyway, let me get the point that I just had in my mind. Words. No. It was about the importance of something. Damn it. That was an important thread. And it was going to connect things. Damn it, now I'm annoyed. Something about a general state of something that's happening recently. Damn it. I was talking about religious stuff. Talking about religious stuff. Just before that I was talking about science and labels. And projecting onto negative purposes. I was talking about that earlier. Because that gives one access to a kind of reflexive. I think I went into that in the last recording. But yeah, we see this theme all over, encoded into. It's very poisonous. Oh, I should get back to the Kegan stages. So the first stage of the mind I would call the superego, the second stage the subconscious, the third the unconscious, and the fourth the ego. And they develop somewhat not in that order. They develop first in the superego, and the ego develop first, in fact, and then the subconscious develops primarily quite quickly second. And when the subconscious is developing, sort of the superego and the ego somewhat amalgamate in relation to the subconscious. And this is the most stable part of development, early development, when you're a child. Not when you're an infant. In some sense, the end of infancy is, in some sense, the induction into the subconscious. And the subconscious has to entreat itself in connection with the superego and perhaps the ego in a very sort of strange way, because it does so over this void or this unyet sort of uncrowded field of the unconsciousness. And so the unconsciousness is a kind of dream field and a dream atmosphere, which is why young children can sometimes prophesy off the smell of the wind. It's just sort of, they're in the soup and they don't have yet enough of an unconscious presence in order to disrupt the subtle eddies and flows that are occurring beyond their pristine subconscious. Now, the subconscious itself is completely unaware of its own inherited perniciousness, and I'll say that its inherited perniciousness, in some sense, is more significant in how it might reflect the iniquity that has been magnetically impregnated into the ego from the superego, but that the superego will in an electrical sense, and I'm using the hermetical magnetic and electric metaphors here, will structure an embodied subconscious which will hope to enter into the unconscious side of the mind and successfully navigate through the unconscious side of the mind and reach up to the ego and marry the magnetic resonance that the superego started with its impregnation thereof. Now, if it does so, you actually end up with a stultified, self-fulfilled, well, I don't want to, self-fulfilled is slightly the wrong term, but essentially you end up in a kind of balanced internal conflagration. You end up in a kind of in a stalemated fulfillment of your own false prophecy, which is actually not really possible. That it's a false prophecy, so it can't be fulfilled. So if it seems to be fulfilled, there must be a lot of correlating collateral damage, and this will have to be dispersed between some combination of the sides of the mind. And it's either contended internally or it's projected externally, or some combination thereof. So that's the state of most people, is that they are present on each side of the mind, because especially in some sense, the side of the mind that really makes the difference of it all is the unconscious. The unconscious is the, when the subconscious enters into the unconscious, that is the real opportunity for some kind of rebirth. Now, the rebirth technology, the baptism by water, uh, in some sense, it can all be summarized as the heuristic: live for today, live for the present. Don't live for the past. Live for the present and the future. That you can leave your past behind, so long as you are consistent in your orientation, or at least coherent in some self-consistent way. Um, that with some perhaps method of conserving one's integrity, one can make a break with the past. Um, that is something like the rebirth by water, and in some sense, that is necessary just to segregate and partition Kegan stage 2 from Kegan stage 3, because Kegan stage 2, in some sense, is an insoluble. What you want is a narrative. What you want is just to have the right wants or beliefs, in some sense. Wants or the inclination that contends believing. And in some sense, you can't not believe things, but you have to be wary that, well, at least when you are objectively, and when I say objectively, I mean unconsciously, when you're unconsciously uh, purveying your own beliefs, how do you ever get something to cut itself, um, if it doesn't have the power to sort of create uh, a new unit of time? If it's under the auspices of some kind of temporal idolatry. The scientific timeline, a line that has two arrows that point in two directions, and the unasked question often is, well, how far does that actually go? And the answer is, we don't know, or I don't know. And so why not turn that line into a plane in which you define and postulate your own position thereon in relation thereto? Well, you can't, you're not allowed to, because it's a line with two arrows, and you don't know where, where they're off to, and how far they actually go. So right there, you've got essentially an outside authority, which is somewhat sort of mystifying you and transfixing you in the uh, iconography of the timeline itself. And essentially gets away with this bit of magic because it says, well, science gave you a computer, science gave you this, science gave you that. Without science, we wouldn't have these nice things. So you're kind of emotionally coerced into some kind of supplication, into the authority, the false authority of people with white lab coats. Now, perhaps false authority is better than no authority, uh, just so that at least the notion of authority itself can be in some seminal. Okay, this is the problem with talking in hypotheticals. You see how strange it gets when you can't just sort of opine in the subjective, and conjecture in the subjective, because, well, that isn't objective enough. That, well, that's just your opinion, man. What's your hypothetical defense to this dubiousness that I can concoct? Well, are you concocting it, or are you actually contending against me with an alternative schema or an alternative preposition that isn't on its face essentially paper thin and essentially concocted just for the purpose of derailing something that I don't want to be too harsh, because there are ways in which you can use thought experiments, but you have to be very careful with thought experiments. It's not as if you can't use thought experiments, but you do have to be incredibly careful. What's my point? Why did I go down this whole rabbit hole? What am I talking about? I'm starting to get... See, this is what happens when you haven't eaten much in 3 days. You just completely lose your train of thinking. I'm tired as well. What was I talking about? I've completely lost it. What shall I... I was talking about... science and language. No, I wasn't talking about language. No, my mind has completely gone blank. Okay, was there anything else on this topic? So I was talking about the Kegan stages slightly. Which, again, as a way to talk about my model of development, I guess, that the ego, I was talking about the unconscious side of the mind and the objective. Then I went off in that rabbit hole, and got lost. That the it's interesting as well that the unconscious side of the mind. Is there a way? So I was talking about baptism. As a way to isolate Kegan stage 3 from Kegan stage 2, which is essentially a temporary measure in order to establish a stable bridge between 3 and 4, and then to properly integrate 4 to fix the superego. So in my view, stage 4, if independently constructed from, in some sense, stage 3 that has turned its back on stage 2 and developed a kind of independent sense of itself, turn stage 4 into a stable, solid state, which is, I would generally call the crucifixion of the ego, or within the ego, the crucifixion specifically of the parent function in MBTI language, although my models have completely different structures of cognitive organization. I've in fact got 17 MBTI-esque models. So in my model there are 17 personality styles that correspond to metatype, and there are 48 personalities that patterns that essentially are similar to Enneagram. Anyway, and those 48 are actually found within the 17 and are stable correlates, although I actually it's hard for me to know that for sure. Actually, I'd need to computer model. I would need to confirm that, because the problem is that the Enneagram model that I have is distinct from the MBTI model, although there is a fixed correlation between them, which is in some sense anyway, it's an interesting. I do actually think it proves a kind of progress, at least over the last. This is a weird thing to say, but I don't know if I want to go down that rabbit hole. But in some non-dualist schools of philosophy and theology, it was regarded that there are 3 basic realities that each have their own reality and are completely distinct and independent, and one of them is the self, and one of them is basically karma, essentially, and another one is God. And in some sense, I believe I have a model that integrates all 3, although in some sense there is almost a dualism in some sense, because the karmic, what I call field circuits, can be reducible within the self, but the model that they actually of the field circuits themselves are basically animals or creatures. Which exist as I want to say abrogations. they need to be mastered, or in some sense you have to sort of lull them into a kind of I can't think of a good enough metaphorical poetical word in my current state, but I was going to say atrophy. You have to basically atrophy them, but into a state of supplication, and that would be sort of transcendence over karma. Anyway, moving on. But in some sense, then there is that. I think in Revelations, this is what is symbolized when it talks about the four beasts that are praising the throne of God, or the throne of the Alpha and the Omega. And I believe it's to the seventh church there is a promise that for those who will, I'm going to misquote it probably, I think, endure, those who will endure will sit with the Father on the throne, or sit with me and share the throne. That might be worth checking up on again. Which church that promise is given? I believe it's the seventh church, which for me correlates to the dominant function in the unconscious side of the mind, as essentially the apex of the bridge, I think, from Kegan stage 2 to Kegan stage 3. So what is being spoken of to the seven churches at the beginning of Revelations is the sequential preparation of the cognitive functions corresponding to someone's subconscious. I'm going to be using some jargon. Excuse me. Subconscious death, subconscious child function, subconscious dominant function, subconscious parent function, subconscious inferior function, and that subconscious inferior and subconscious sin, and that subconscious inferior function and subconscious sin is also the same as the unconscious's death and child function. And the death and the child function in any side of the mind is synthesized by the dominant function, which is the proceeding after the two, which is in some sense has to be able to wrestle those two functions from the double subscription of those functions by the preceding side of the mind. And so this is a lot of the toxicity in some sense, is that the dominant function is amalgamating the cross-pollination and, let's say, inherited toxicity of the subconscious. The naive narcissism of the subconscious is being implanted into the unconscious's dominant function. And this is archetypally, I generally, when I talk about this developmentally, I describe it as the Tower of Babel, essentially. That the dominant function will always be seeking to develop some kind of Tower of Babel, and that is how you know you're dealing with someone who is still locked into what I would generally call Kegan stage 2.5, which means that they are in their unconscious, but they are a partisan of their naive narcissism. And this is what scientism fucking is. This is all the bullshit of, well, yeah, science knows what's going on. The timeline, the arrows on the timeline tell us that science is we just have to follow what science wants from us, or what science tells us for, or whatever, because that's the only way that we get nice things, because we don't know how far the arrows go, and science is the only thing that points the way. It's a fucking narrative inception. It's naive narcissism. Okay, so that's what's happening in the dominant function, symbolically, and in some sense, what then that is being from the magnetic resonance, from the superego side, even the ego is impregnated in its dominant function. That you see from there's a reverse kind of thing happening from the parent function in the superego to the parent function of the ego. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One, two, three, four, 5, 6. Yeah, that is 6. And then from the dominant function of the ego to the parent function in the unconscious, that is 1, 2, 3, 4. That's just 4. Anyway, I guess the numbers that correspond here that are relevant is that the dominant function in the ego is the scarlet dragon. The inferior function in the ego is the whore of Babylon, or the rider of the scarlet dragon, the names of blasphemy. And the waters that it sits on top of is essentially the stretched down to the sorry, there is a special name for this now. I can't remember what it is. But basically, from also the parent function in the unconscious to the parent function of the ego, which is 5 is 5 dimensions. Those 5 dimensions, damn, what are they called? There's a special reference to them in Revelations. I'll remember it now. It's the names of blasphemy is the parent function in the ego. The dominant function in the ego is the scarlet dragon. And below that are the waters. No, but it's more than that. What were they called? Oh yes, the unclean spirits. The unclean spirits. Yeah, the 3 below. So it is the names of blasphemy, the scarlet dragon, and then the 3 below that are the unclean spirits of the false prophets. So, no, let me get the order right. The unclean spirits of. No, I'm not going to get the order right, but it's the dragon and the false prophet and dragon, the false and the beast, the dragon, the false prophet, and the beast. And those three unclean spirits correspond to the parent function in the unconscious, the inferior function in the unconscious, and the sin of the unconscious. And you must always remember that the inferior function and the sin of the unconscious are also the death and the lust, or the death and the child function of the ego, because the inferior function and the sin are always repurposed by the next side of the mind. And so the parent function in the unconscious is essentially the unclean spirit of all. It's not it isn't the unclean spirit of the false prophet, but it will contain the unclean spirit of the false prophet, and it must come out of it, like it's described in Revelations as like a frog. It comes out of the mouth. So you need to get the frog out of the parent function of the unconscious, and you have to get the of the unconscious parent function, and in some sense that false prophet, because you see that parent function is resonating through the ego from the magnetic resonance that the ego was implanted with by the superego. And so you have to already be sensitive in some sense to do the work of fixing the superego, because the superego is toxic right from the start. Original sin. Well, it's anyway. Let me not use perhaps strange words, but the false prophet, the prime false prophet, is the parent function in the superego, and the spirit of that false prophet is laden in the three functions, which are the latter three functions of the unconscious side of the mind, which are the unconscious parent, the unconscious inferior, and the unconscious sin. And so you need to fix the unconscious before the ego can be liberated. The ego will only be liberated when the unconscious is fully cleansed, essentially. And after the unconscious is cleansed, then the ego can actually go to war with the superego in some sense, because then when the ego crucifies its parent function, it will at the same time be rehabilitating the dominant function in the superego, which never had a dominant function before, because essentially it was the root of the world tree. It was the fall of the tree of life into the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It is my contention that those are essentially the same tree, but the one is the tree that is guarded by the way. I said that wrong. Guarded by the sword that turns every way, that keeps the way of the tree of life. That is essentially the dominant function. In the superego, in the unself-actualized, in the unself-realized, in the misunderstanding or the non-understanding of godliness. And the true understanding of godliness is to know that the life is in the only begotten Son. Which is effectively the ego. The ego is the only begotten Son. And so your ego must become a static state so that you can share it and see it as being the same condition as other people's ego. It must be capable of being replicable like that. It has to become a static state. The crucifixion has to become I die daily, it says in Corinthians, to use some reference material, but essentially the death there is particularly the death of the fleshly thinking, which is the thinking of the parent function in the ego. And also the disassociation of the parent function's hold over the inferior function. And in some sense, it is the vindication of the inferior function, because it is the vindication of the inferior function in the ego, which is what is resurrected, essentially, and is what particularly revives and is the pilot flame for the dominant function in the superego. Which is a technical, it's quite a complicated technical thing, which I'm still in the process of working out the language to describe. But then I have to get into very detailed nuances of each dimension of psychological reality, which is basically my model of the consciousness within the self, and also the metaphysical. In some sense, it is a map of heaven and earth, which I roughly call the 17 model. The 17 model of dimensions. I sometimes call them spheres of psychological reality, or I can't even remember all the things. Wow. Anyway, I guess this is quite enough pontification for one day. Did I finish the claim that I wanted to make, that psychology is roughly modeled on there's a leg of an argument there which I haven't, I think, stated in these last two recordings, which I should state, which is you're dealing with a field that is and I did say the thing about legal narcotics. And I did say the thing about maximizing a high trust society while putting a ceiling on integrity. well, integrity is the fruit that has the seed of the fruit inside itself. And trust is something like, well, if you just care about maximizing high trust, it's certainly easier to eat seedless grapes, but you have to keep on going back to buy more because you'll never be able to plant some in your own back garden. Weird kind of metaphors to make.